your safety managers are who you are relying on to kind of curb that conduct before it balloons into a systemic problem that then comes back to haunt you as the fleet.
Hey everybody, Daniel here from the Truck Insurance Channel. Today I've got Brandon Wiseman on, and we're going to talk about some safety and compliance stuff. Brandon, if you'd introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. Hey, everyone, I'm Brandon Wiseman, president of TruckSafe and a partner with the Childress Law Firm. We help fleets with DOT compliance issues, so looking forward to our discussion today.
Nice, man, and thanks for coming on. Really appreciate it. What steps should new fleets take to ensure compliance with federal regulations and safety standards in the trucking industry?
Wow, that's a loaded question. Pretty much what my entire business is about is helping fleets kind of develop these policies and procedures for helping keep them out of trouble. Well, number one, you got to understand the regulatory environment in which you operate. So many fleets, in my experience, fail on the compliance front just because they are not educated enough on what rules apply to their operations. And so if you don't know what rules you're playing by, then you're bound to end up with violations. And then next thing you know, you're getting an audit and you're getting shut down. So first things first, train yourself, educate yourself on the rules in which you operate, and that will go a long way to keeping you out of trouble.
Okay. Well, I've got a good follow-up question for that then. How can fleets stay informed about changes in safety regulations and ensure that their fleet and drivers remain compliant with the latest requirements?
Yeah, there's a few different ways. The way I like to stay up to date is just by following industry publications on social media. I seem to get the most timely updates about regulatory changes through that means than anywhere else. But if you want to subscribe to an official source of regulatory changes, you can subscribe to the Federal Register, which is where all federal regulatory changes get published, and then that's where you can find the comment period. You can go in and comment if you have any feedback on the regulations that the FMCSA is publishing. But in that Federal Register, I think it's just federalregister.gov, you can subscribe to different regulatory administrative agencies and follow their rulemaking activity. So I subscribe to the FMCSA's updates, and then I get an email alert anytime they are publishing a notice or any kind of proposed rule or anything like that. So that's the official source where you can follow along there. But also, like I said, just industry publications. We do that through TruckSafe. We have a newsletter that goes out, and anytime there's any kind of breaking news or anything like that. So that tends to be the best source.
We'll link to that in the description below, and then maybe some others. And then anybody watching, if they want to comment their favorite trucking publication, if you want to share, go ahead and do that as well. All right. So what about training? Like what should fleets be implementing to ensure their drivers receive proper training and possess the necessary knowledge about safety procedures, emergency protocols, and defensive driving technique?
Yeah. So the regulations, federal and state, believe it or not, don't have a whole lot to say about training. They do not mandate any specific types or content of your training except in limited circumstances, like for hazmat employees and drivers operating longer combination vehicles. Those kind of rare instances, the regulations have something to say about the training. But other than that, as a fleet, you're kind of on your own. But the good news is there's plenty of training providers out there and good training providers, and you can source a lot of your content from them. There's a lot of well-known brands out there that offer good driver training. I always like to kind of break training into a couple of buckets. The first bucket would be regulatory compliance. Again, going back to that idea of understanding the rules under which you are operating. If your drivers don't understand the hours of service rules, for example, then they're inevitably going to get tagged with hours of service violations during roadside inspections, and that's going to come back to haunt you as the trucking company that employs or contracts with them. So they need some kind of training, and I recommend that it be recurrent training on regulatory compliance at some cadence, whatever cadence you pick. You could do it yourself if you want to have safety meetings, that type of thing. A lot of trucking companies will have periodic safety meetings where they bring all the drivers in, or they do it virtually nowadays, and they tackle a particular topic about regulatory compliance. If you don't want to do it yourself, like I said, you could source it from a third party. So that's the first bucket. The second bucket is defensive driving type training, how to actually safely operate the vehicles that you are expecting them to operate. Again, no shortage of third parties out there that offer that type of training. You hear a lot of people talk about Smith's system and other trainings like that. But I think those are the two big buckets that you need to focus on when it comes to driver training.
Are there any third parties or resources you recommend?
There's a lot that I like. I tend to stick with the more well-known brands. So I mentioned Smith Systems for kind of the defensive driving. I like them a lot. On the regulatory compliance side of things, I don't want to make this a plug for my own stuff, but really,
Okay,
we
feel free.
developed our own content through TruckSafe
Yeah.
specifically for that purpose of that first bucket of regulatory compliance. So we built out online courses both for safety managers, kind of train the trainer type deal, and then also for commercial drivers, all about understanding the regulations. And I think the reason I wanted to do that is we had a bit of a unique perspective, being transportation lawyers for a long time and working with the rules and the nuances of them. I think we had something unique to offer in that sense. So I like our training on the regulatory compliance side of things.
Okay, you might have just answered at least part of this, but what separates TruckSafe apart from like competitors in the training realm?
Yeah, I would say our big advantage, and don't get me wrong, we work with a lot of consultants and have for many years in our capacity as transportation lawyers. And there's a lot of great consultants that offer a lot of great content, not taking anything away from them. But the reason I wanted to split TruckSafe or to start TruckSafe on my own is because I felt like there was a little bit of a lack of good regulatory compliance training specifically for safety managers. So not necessarily drivers. Again, plenty of content for drivers, but what I felt was lacking was an in-depth discussion or analysis of the regulatory environment in which trucking companies are expected to operate. So we developed that on our own, and I think our perspective on it, having worked with some of the nation's largest trucking companies for over a decade at this point, and seeing how those regulations play out in all of the various scenarios and the uniqueness of those trucking companies' operations, gave us a good insight on these types of regulations. So I think that's kind of what separates us from others.
No, I know there's tons of info out there for the drivers. Training the trainers, though, I really like that aspect. That's interesting.
It's important too, because obviously that's your kind of frontline defense. There are your safety managers, the folks that are overseeing the drivers. And as your drivers are going along operating and they're incurring violations roadside, your safety managers are who you are relying on to kind of curb that conduct before it balloons into a systemic problem that then comes back to haunt you as the fleet. And if your frontline safety managers don't have the education that they need to stay up to date on all of these regulations that can be complex in a lot of different areas, then you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot. So there needs to be a good training, not only for the drivers, but also for everybody that is expected to be managing your compliance program for you.
Okay, let's talk about a big pain point for everybody. How can fleets best manage driver hour of service and ensure compliance to regulations regarding maximum driving hours and mandatory rest periods?
Hours of service, for whatever reason, is a huge problem for a lot of fleets in the United States. Probably one of the biggest problems
Right.
that we experience and with the fleets that we work with. And, I think it comes down to a couple of things. Number one, it comes down to just not holding drivers accountable to these issues. So, it's not reasonable to expect you to have a 0% violation rate if you're a fleet of any size. You're going to incur violations. But my concern and the concern of the DOT is always kind of patterns of noncompliance. And so what I found is that fleets who struggle with hours of service, more often than not, they're struggling because they are not holding their drivers accountable to the violations that occur roadside. And then those start to add up over time. And all of a sudden, we've got a pattern of noncompliance with the hours of service regulations because there are no consequences. You're not holding your drivers accountable for those violations. They incur them and they are allowed to go on their way. without anything from you, but except maybe just, hey, maybe don't do that next time, something like that.
Right.
If there aren't serious consequences for those violations, your drivers are just going to keep incurring them time after time. And before you know it, like I said, you've got a trend. And now those trends are what the DOT is looking for with CSA scores, for example. As you incur more and more hours of service violations, that's when your hours of service CSA score starts to tick up. And then next thing you know, DOT's knocking on your door to do an audit. So I think finding a way that works for your fleet to hold your drivers accountable to these rules is probably the most important thing that you can do to get control of the hours of service. And then the other thing is just education. A lot of times when it comes to fleets that have problems, systemic problems with hours of service, I find that it is because their drivers just don't understand those rules well enough. And there are certain areas, nuances of the hours of service rules that can get tricky, like personal conveyance use, for example, has always been a gray area within the regulations. Split sleeper berth is a complex aspect of keeping track of time. And so it's easy to get caught up in this web of complexity. But if you have a firm foundation of training your drivers and educating them on the topics where they are having trouble, then you can really start to get control of it.
Nice. All right. So here's another question for you. What strategies can be employed to establish and promote a strong safety culture with a new or even existing trucking organization, just to encourage employees to prioritize safety and compliance in daily activities?
Anybody who follows us knows that I don't like the term safety culture. The only reason I don't like the term is because I feel like it is a crutch that people use and it has become so overused that it's become like meaningless business speak at this point. What it is describing is something that is critically important. What I like to focus my attention on is making sure that we have a top-down approach to safety and compliance. That is essentially what a safety culture is describing. If you are a trucking company that is expecting all of this stuff of your drivers, but you're not living that out yourself as the manager or as the CEO, then it's falling on deaf ears because they're seeing your actions. If you're saying, oh, we expect you to comply with the regulations, but then you're telling them, hey, you need to get the job done, even if you're running out of hours. Right. What you're communicating to them is that you don't care about compliance. And so how can you expect them to care about compliance? So the point is, if I'm a trucking company owner, as overused as it is, I need to have the safety first mindset. I need to make sure that I am all in when it comes to safety and compliance, and then communicate that down the chain. And then as my safety managers and as my drivers see me living out that philosophy, then it's much easier to expect that of those below you.
I like that top-down approach. I feel like way more companies need to implement something like that, or be aware of it.
It's a big problem. I mean, so many of the fleets we work with, they may say that in their safety policy, and they may say safety is our number one priority, which
that's the actual practice. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But what are you actually doing behind closed doors? Are you implementing policies that make it hard for your drivers? This is the most common example. You're making it hard for your drivers to get the work done within their allotted hours. And so you are driving them to a point where they are essentially forced to violate the hours of service rules. If you have that as your approach, then how can you ever expect your drivers to take that type of stuff seriously?
How much responsibility do you think falls on shippers and receivers in that scenario?
Yeah, so a couple of things here. So number one, historically, shippers and brokers and third-party intermediaries had not been regulated by the FMCSA in terms of hours of service. So in other words, historically, there were no consequences for shippers and brokers that would essentially run a motor carrier's drivers into hours of service violations. More recently, within the last 10 years, that has changed. The FMCSA has actually implemented regulations that make it a violation for a shipper or a broker to coerce a commercial driver, into violating the hours of service rules. Now, that rule is on the books. Is it ever enforced? Not very often. it takes a complaint by a driver. A driver has to make a complaint to the FMCSA that a shipper or a broker has coerced them into violating the hours of service rules, and then that has to get investigated and corroborated by evidence, and then maybe the FMCSA takes, slaps the shipper on the wrist or something like that. I haven't seen it happen very often, but suffice it to say, there is now a regulatory mechanism to hold shippers and brokers liable for that type of conduct. Aside from that, their exposure comes in the form of highway accident litigation. If you have a shipper or a broker who is pushing a driver, even if it's not their driver, it's the driver of one of the third-party carriers that they use, if they are pushing them to a point of exhaustion, and now they've got drivers out there hauling their freight, and they're drowsy and they end up killing somebody, that shipper or broker is going to be brought into that litigation inevitably. And it's going to be argued that their conduct contributed significantly to that accident. And then they're going to be held accountable in the context of that litigation. And that's where we start to see these multi-million-dollar nuclear verdicts in those types of cases. So those kinds of cases where shippers and brokers are being held liable for their interactions with drivers are becoming more and more prominent. So even if we didn't have that regulatory side of things, that exposure that stems from highway accident litigation should be a deterrent.
Wow, that's interesting. I know a lot of people talk about that, and I hear it from the truckers. The flip side to complaining, right, is, well, you might not ever work with that shipper again.
True.
And that could be a good source of revenue for your company. So that's tough.
True.
But yeah. Okay. Let me hit you with one more question. Can you provide advice on successfully implementing safety improvement initiatives or programs that can have a significant impact on reducing accidents or improving compliance with a new or existing trucking operation?
Yeah. It's so fleet specific. I don't have a one size fits all approach to this for any one carrier. What I recommend is, number one, you got to first understand what's contributing to your problems if you are having them. That saying, you can't improve what it is that you don't measure. If you don't know your problem areas, how are you ever going to get things under control? So number one, you need to make sure you understand where you have gaps. The best way to do that, if you're an interstate motor carrier, is watching your safety measurement system account on a monthly basis. That's detailing all of the violations, the regulatory compliance violations that your drivers are incurring roadside on a month-to-month basis. And that's where you start to look for those trends. Again, I'm not so concerned with the one-off violations here or there. I get concerned when you're starting to have a pattern of violations in a particular area. So if you look on your safety measurement system account and you see that your hours of service score is starting to trend upwards, then it's time to get control of it. So now you understand where you have a gap. And what do you do about that gap? Well, you need to do some more digging and figure out what's leading to those violations that you're incurring. If it's hours of service violations, it's probably a driver training or accountability issue. That's really all there is to explain those types of things. And so the only fix to that, it takes work on your part. That's what I've found a lot of motor carriers don't want to hear. That's the news they don't want to hear. So many motor carriers want a quick fix to everything. There is no quick fix to this. It takes time, it takes effort, it takes money on your part to make sure that your drivers are fully up to speed on their regulatory obligations and to hold them accountable when you are having repeat offenders, including up to termination. Nobody wants to terminate drivers in this kind of driver shortage that we are allegedly in the midst of at this point. But sometimes it's necessary to get rid of poor performing drivers because they are driving your company into the ground. And so holding them accountable, giving them training that they need to understand the rules is really the work that it takes to improve your scores and to keep compliant.
I like it. That's tough. No one wants driver turnover, but sometimes you do got to, hold yourself, your company, your other drivers accountable by terminating someone.
Exactly.
Man, you are like the encyclopedia of safety and compliance.
Yeah, you can check us out at trucksafe.com. We've got all kinds of content. We've got a YouTube channel where we're constantly publishing this type of compliance content. We've got a newsletter, like I said. We've got our online courses. And we also have a social network for safety professionals within this industry that's free to join. It includes a forum where you can go in, ask questions, get answers, and then also have access to all of our DOT compliance content. So check that all out, trucksafe.com.
Awesome. All right. Well, man, anybody watching, like, subscribe, you know what to do there. Go check out TruckSafe and Brandon's channel. And Brandon, if you ever want me to come on your channel, I'm more than happy to talk
Absolutely.
about any insurance type related stuff. Being where you're at, I'm sure you know a good bit. But
No, definitely. Yeah, we'll definitely get you on soon. Thanks for having me.